Bueller?
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
No problem whatsoever.
Bueller?
I do want to say welcome to the very first lesson of Comic Writing 101. And originally I thought it was going to be myself and Mr. Pellegrini, but we have been very lucky. We actually have Mr. Pellegrini and Mr. Sparrow in the house. These are both two accomplished comic book writers. Very honored to have them here on the show. And we're going to be doing this for a while. This is basically, there aren't a lot of resources just as far as out there for comic book writing. There's a lot of writing resources. We wanted to put something together as far as being able to write comic books. So today we're going to talk about brainstorming, getting your ideas down. I think next week we're going to do start talking about overviews. But we're going to get into scripting, creating hero characters, creating villains, dialogue, get into some marketing, things like that. Obviously, you both have a lot of experience. First up is Mr. Mark Pellegrini. Do you want to give the credentials and let people know why they should probably be listening to you as you talk about comic book writing?
Well, as for my credentials as an author, I write naughty limericks on the bathroom wall, and those are very popular, I've heard. But as a comic book writer, I've written Common America with artist Timothy Lim, who co-plots with me. I've also written Black Hops, USAGI, another one with Tim. I had a chance to do some dialogue punch-ups with Chuck Dixon on a political parody comic we did called Trump Space Force. As a writer in general of prose, I've written some horror novels and short stories. My short story has been published in Cursova magazine. My novel's available on Amazon. It's titled They'll Get You. You can find it on my Amazon page. And yeah, I love writing.
And also, if people are interested in crowdfunding, you have been very successful with your crowdfunding efforts with Common America. I believe Volume 2 did well over 100,000 between Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and Volume 3 is out right now, and it's also doing very well. It looks like it's going to go well over 100,000 as well.
Oh no, I forgot to shill. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, Common America 3 is currently available on Kickstarter right now. I believe we have 10 days left on it. Common America we call it a campaign, but it's actually a pre-order. The book's already completed and printed. So as soon as the Kickstarter ends and the funds clear, we start fulfillment, and we intend to have it fulfilled by early April, if not sometime in March. It all really depends on the USPS slowdown, how that goes.
Awesome. So also with us is Mr. Aaron Sparrow. Now, you have had a little bit more experience within mainstream comic industry. You've worked with some manga adaptations. You actually worked for Boom Studios. You were the chief editor for their Disney line. So you've had a lot of experience. You also were the writer of Darkwing Duck. What else can you say about your experience? What exactly are you bringing to the table here today?
I'm bringing a lot of editorial experience. So I've worked with a great number of writers, helping them develop their stories, helping them improve. It's one of the things that I think is not really present in a lot of editorial today. It seems like, they're mostly middlemen. They get a script. They don't do anything with it except pass it along, because you've got a lot of green writers who, I think have some natural raw talent, but they're not being developed properly. So I spent a lot of time doing that with my writers on, the different Disney titles. I've worked for Ape Entertainment. We did, Richie Rich. We did the DreamWorks books. I've worked with Sesame Workshop, developing properties, the comic book properties based on these IPs. So yeah, I've had a hand in a great many different aspects of the industry.
And you've actually done some television writing yourself, so it's not like you're just a comic book writer. You're a very well-rounded writer as well.
Yeah, I've got some things that I can't announce yet that are coming out probably in a year or so. So I'm really excited to talk about it, but I can't yet. But as soon as I can, I'll come on the show and we can chat about it.
Absolutely. So today we're going to just start out with talking about brainstorming, developing your idea. Aaron, when you're thinking about an idea or you have an idea, what exactly goes into your brainstorming process? Do you always have a notepad with you? What are the essentials to where you can start developing and fleshing out this very small idea and start growing into something that could become a comic book?
Well, normally I'll jot down. I do carry a notebook with me because you never know when inspiration's going to strike. I also think it's a good idea to have a notebook next to your bed because sometimes you'll wake up and you'll have this great idea, and then you think to yourself, "Oh, well, it's such a great idea. I'll remember that in the morning." And of course, you don't, or you don't remember all of it, or you're like, "How did I get there? What was that?" So I think it's good to have a notepad with you at all times so you can jot down ideas. You'll see things, out on the streets where you're like, "Oh, I gotta make a note of that." Because I want to remember that because there could be a story idea or even dialogue. You have conversations with people and you'll have a good little repartee and you're like, I could really develop that into something, or put that into a character's mouth. And so I think it's definitely beneficial to always have something to write with, or if you don't have that, you've got your phone, you can put it in your notepad. These are all really good tools for writers to make sure that they have, always have some resources so that you can record things because, if you're like me, your memory is not always going to hold up for you.
That's my big problem is that if I don't write something down, I will 100% forget it. I've had like Tim and friends of mine tell me jokes that they say like, "Mark, you made that joke up." I'm like, "I did?" I'm like, "Yes." And like, "Oh, I have no memory of doing that." I think I'm probably going to be the first of all my friends to like get Alzheimer's. I think it's already setting in. But so I use my phone a lot. I used to carry a notepad with me. In fact, I used to carry just scrap paper in my pocket and a pen, and I would jot it down on like these scraps of Xerox paper. But I don't do that anymore. What I do is I use the Gmail app on my phone, and any idea I have, I just send an email to myself, and my inbox will just be full of all these like 1 or 2 sentence emails. But at least that way I get it written down when I'm on the go. 2, I have it as basically a notification when I get home and turn on my PC and I go to my Gmail, and there's all those emails in there full of my ideas, so I can write them down and store them in like a Word document or something. I try not to let anything go to waste because you never know, like especially because I write short stories. So if I have just like the germ of an idea, I'll write it down. I got that from H.P. Lovecraft. Some of his, and he had this his book of ideas of his stories, and they're famous because August Derleth, he would take those 1 sentence ideas, and then he would write a completely original story. But then he'd call it a posthumous collaboration with H.P. Lovecraft. But basically, Lovecraft's ideas, would just be like 1 sentence of like, a man walks into a tomb and what he finds there. And that's it. And then he would extrapolate a whole story based on that. But he wrote it down, every single little idea. And that's always a good, that's a good habit to form, just so nothing ever escapes you.
Mark, I
So
hate
would
to
you?
point this out to you, but due to your, if you read your end user license agreement, all of your ideas are owned by Google now.
Oh, I'm pretty sure that I'm owned by Google now, though I may be in a custody battle between Google and Apple. I'm really not sure.
So how important is it, to be thinking about your setting, the genre of the story that you want to tell? Or do you think you should, during the brainstorming, it should be like the bare bones, this is the story that I want to tell, and then you flesh it out as far as setting and those kind of details later? Or you have a genre, you should have a setting, or maybe even like an ending or a big twist in mind as you're doing the brainstorming? What are your thoughts on that one, Mark?
Well, so when I try to start getting organized, taking basically all my little scraps of notes, I like to write character Bibles, story Bibles, and world Bibles, basically. So I'll have my list of characters. And so like for Black Ops USAGI is that series I do with Tim. That's about a group of irradiated animals who work as commandos for the U.S. government, and they have human partners who work as their translators. We call them their handlers. And then the villains are a terrorist organization called Cryptic, who creates or weaponizes cryptids, cryptozoological creatures. And from there, basically, I like to start with the characters because I feel like the stories always unfold from the characters. So if I come up with the germ of an idea for a character, from that point, I can come up with their name. I can come up with their personality. I can write their backstory, their history. Basically, I write like a who's who in the Marvel universe kind of A to Z guide profile entry for this character, and I'll come up with their whole life story. their abilities, their weaknesses, all that kind of stuff. And from there, once I have an idea of who the character is, I can design a story around them, decide how that story affects the protagonist or the antagonist, how it redirects the narrative of that universe. And then everything is essentially character driven because, what's a story without characters, right? So that's
Yeah.
usually where I start with. Yeah.
I'm much the same for me. I write out a character Bible. I do, exactly like Mark. I do I was a big fan of the Handbook of the Marvel Universe when I was a kid. When I first discovered comics, I bought those and I would just lie on the floor and I would read all these entries for these characters that I had never actually seen appear in a comic. Some of them were already dead. Some of them, had been written out. But I would read these rich bios and just be fascinated, and it really connected me to those characters, and it's why I'm still connected to those characters today, and why I appreciate them. And I buy their action figures. I buy action figures of characters I've never read a story of, but I read their handbook entry, and so I'm attached to them. So I approach my writing the same way. Usually or typically, I have worked on licensed material, so the characters are kind of already developed, but I will still write out, kind of where I see them and where I see them going, and then let them drive the story, which I think is where you get your best stories from. Anytime your characters are pushing the plot forward, that story works. Anytime your characters are just bouncing from set piece to set piece in a story, that story is ultimately unsatisfying because you don't care about any of the events. I watched Rise of Skywalker and I was completely numb because I don't care about any of these characters. So their adventure, bouncing from neat visual to neat visual means nothing to me. Ultimately, it's just empty calories. What I want is a story that has meat and that people connect to and people care about where it's going and they're surprised and there's twists and turns and ultimately at the end it's a satisfying experience, even if it didn't go the way, especially if it didn't go the way that they wanted it to go or they thought that it was going to go, but hopefully it's still ultimately satisfying. And
Right. Oh, sorry. Go on.
yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, it's just yeah, exactly. And when I write those, those profiles, those A to Z guides on a character, and I come up with they were born in this city or they were born in this country. This is what their youth was like. This is what led them down the path to joining the heroes or joining the villains or being whatever free agent they might be, et cetera, et cetera. None of that is in canon because there's not really a canon yet. It's still mutable. It's still malleable. And you don't have, until you actually put it in the narrative of your book and publish it, none of it is set in stone, which I think a lot of people need to, if they do the character guide thing, it's something they need to be okay with, is that, once you write this bio for your character, you can change it and alter it to go with the flow of your story because your story is always growing and changing around you. Just an example, and I can't give too many details away because I don't want to do spoilers for Black Ops X Common America, which comes out in the summer. But there's this character. So my character Bibles that I do for Black Ops are where I just put a lot of ideas and I send them to Tim for characters that we could use or may never use. And they have there's this backstory and history. And there's one character who I created as to be one of the heroes, to be a member of Black Ops. And I wrote their backstory up, their whole long history and everything, their personality. Even sent a few reference photos of this is the kind of body type the person would have. This is the kind of expressions and gestures they would make, etc., to show their personality. And then Tim got back to me because we edit each other and we both try to plus each other. And his response this character is really cool, but I think they would work better on the villain team because as a member of Cryptic, just because they would add a sort of personality diversity to that team. That team's not just a bunch of sneering, mustache twirling villains. We have this one character who in any other setting would seem like they'd be part of the heroes. When we put them with the villains, they really mix things up. And so I like that idea. And so when people read Black Ops X Common America, they're going to meet a new character. And that character was initially envisioned as a hero. And the original bio I wrote for them was as a hero. But they got put into the villains, and they work so much better that way. So things can change and grow.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you have a well-developed character and you're working with them. Whether you created them or they've already been established by somebody else. Once you really tap into their head, they will direct the story. I think I've told the story before, Wes, when I've been on. that when I was writing the final 2 issues of Darkwing, which I found out were going to be the final 2 issues halfway through the script for the first part. And then the next issue that we were going to publish was actually going to be a different story. But when they told me, like, yeah, you've only got 2 issues to kind of wrap this up, I was like, well, I'm just going to expand this story then and make it bigger and try and have a more satisfying payoff, because, you know, we're going on hiatus and I don't know if we're coming back. And I leaned into the character of Bushroot, who's a character I had never written solo before. He'd always been part of the Fearsome Five when I'd written him. So he was always playing off the other characters. So having to take him and kind of make him the focus of the story, my ending actually completely changed. And that doesn't often happen, because I usually have an idea and then I come up with the ending, because in my mind, the ending has to be satisfying to the reader. So I have to know where I'm going. But when I started writing, I started to bring Bushroot in more than he was originally intended in the story, because originally he only had a cameo because it was just a one-off. He kind of took control of where it was going to go with the personality that was established on the cartoon, and the story became a sweeter, more tragic story, because he's a more tragic character. And when we got to the end, it was kind of like a nice little, somewhat of a redemption arc for him as a villain. It established a lot of, you know, like, new directions that we could go, and that was all because the character was so strong. So you can't be afraid when you're a writer too, when you've developed, you know, your own characters, and they're so real in your head. If they start to direct the story, you can lean into that and you can change your plan, because you might come up with something really great. Because if you've developed these characters well and they're fully rounded and have personalities and they play off each other in the right ways, they'll start to tell you where they're going to go.
So it's that you'll hear sometimes when people say, like, "Oh, the story writes itself," that, or the characters write themselves. That's basically what you're talking about is what other people say when they mean, like, such and such writes itself. It's that if your character is so vivid in your mind, so well rounded, and their fundamentals and their attitudes and their personalities are so so vivid and distinct, that they, like you said, they kind of start steering the ship, because you know instinctively as a writer what their decisions are going to be, how they're going to control the plot. I did a video on the Bunderdome about character fundamentals and why it's really important to establish those before you even introduce your character. And it's part of, like, you know, writing the character Bible kind of thing. Is that once you know what your character represents fundamentally and what their role is in the story, that dictates their dynamics with the rest of the cast. That dictates how they solve a problem concerning the conflict of the story. That dictates the kinds of jokes they'll make. That dictates how they might manipulate or coerce another character. And the best example I could think of, Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis came up with the cast of Ghostbusters. They were each supposed to represent an aspect of the sciences and the work. So, like, Peter Venkman represented the soft sciences. That's why he's a parapsychologist / psychologist. He has PhDs in both of those. Egon represented the STEM sciences. He's the engineer. He's the one who builds the equipment. Ray is the research scientist. That's why he's always quoting things from history, like the Philadelphia mass turbulence of 1947 or the Tunguska blast of 1909. It was actually 1908. Or and he misquotes stuff, like he misquoted the Bible. Like, he gets his research wrong occasionally. And Winston represented the working class. He's the one who found the Ghostbusters in the want ad, and he's the one who always has some real world experience to apply, because even though they're all scientists, they still have their own, small business, their own personal industry. And so that's why Winston fits in. He's really important to that. But once you understand those fundamentals of each character, then you know how they're going to respond to every situation and steer the story. If there's a conflict and you need Winston to solve it, Winston's the one who can say, like, "Oh, I'll handle this. I used to be a construction worker," which is like something they use in the cartoon. Or like, "I'll handle this. I was in the Marines," and so he can do something, like that. Peter, because he's a psychologist, the way he manipulates the situation to solve a conflict is he'll basically use his mouth, he'll use his brains, and he'll trick people, like or manipulate people. Like when he knows that he can't outsmart Egon, but he knows that Egon has a sweet tooth, so if he wants to coerce Egon, he'll offer him a Crunch Bar or something like that. Or he knows that Ray is a big kid, so he can kind of bully him. So like in Ghostbusters 2, he'll pull on his ears until Ray goes, "It's Dana Barrett." or with Winston, because Winston's a guy who treats the Ghostbusters as just a 9-to-5 job. There's a deleted scene in the first movie where he manipulates Winston into going with them to fight Gozer by basically offering him to be a partner in the Ghostbusters Corporation. And so that offer of extra money is what coerces Winston practically to go up and go to that final battle. But all of those fundamentals of the character are all what drives your decisions and their decisions within the story, your decisions as the writer, their decisions within the story that moves the plot along. If you don't have that fundamental base of your character, which you come up with when you write your character Bible or whatever, then the characters aren't going to feel alive and they aren't going to feel like they're making their own decisions. And you kind of won't have that ease of the story writing itself, like Aaron mentioned, if you don't do your groundwork first.
So when you're doing the brainstorming, you're saying when you're brainstorming, it's character centric. I imagine you're writing other notes down besides what the characters are going to be. Once you've developed a character, is that when you start looking at some of those other notes and seeing, is this the kind of conflict that's going to work for this character that maybe shows progression, things like that? Is that when you start to maybe start piecing things together, and maybe you can start looking at your outline and maybe how you're going to move forward with your story?
Yeah, definitely. The one thing that I think is one of the things that I think that is really important is if you write your character and you create them in an organic way where you have to include some flaws, you have to give them some personality defects, they have to have some things to overcome, because when you write the story, like what is the character going to learn by the end of this story? How is the character going to grow and develop, and what will be their takeaway from this that will continue with the character moving forward? I think that's really important. The problem with kind of the episodic nature of comics and television and things like that is because there's a Simpsons joke about how everything has to go back to the starting position for the next episode. And there's certainly an element of that in comics, definitely, but you still, to keep the reader engaged and to keep these characters meaningful, they have to learn things, and then later as a writer you can call back to those things, and it's really satisfying because you get to see the characters grow and you get to see how they handle dynamics in the future based on what they've learned in the past, just like we all do as human beings. We're always developing and growing and changing and hopefully getting better, getting smarter, making wiser decisions, and your character should be able to do that too. And to give them flaws and defects and so that they have complicated interactions with people, that really humanizes them and helps us connect to them. I always use Into the Spider-Verse as an example. Even though these things were kind of present in the comics, I never really connected with Miles Morales in the comics. I kind of liked him, but I didn't really feel a connection to him. And when I saw Into the Spider-Verse, I thought that they just amped everything up to a level that I was able to connect. He had flaws, he had fears, he had insecurities. That's huge. Your character needs to have insecurities. We've all got them. If your character is just confident all the time and they overcome every obstacle easily, how do we identify with their struggle? None of us have that ability. None of us overcome everything, with simplicity. We all have struggles and we all have things and we fail and we have to pick ourselves back up. And that's the heroic journey. That's what we should be striving to write. And we should be inspiring readers with these characters and with these stories and with heroic fiction, because that's the human experience, overcoming obstacles and triumphing over adversity. These are things that I feel like we've lost in a lot of our current stories. And it's really the most important element in making these things timeless.
So, Mark, is there anything else that you wanted to add just about brainstorming before we kind of maybe reset things and talk, and get everything lined up for the next episode where we're going to talk about outlining your actual story, just for the viewers, or as far as what the brainstorming process or anything that you wanted to mention or forgot?
Well, I think we've covered basically a lot of the brainstorming stuff, which I know it seems like so easy. Like everybody has ideas, write your ideas down. Isn't that obvious? A lot of it comes down to the way you write things down. You really want to organize your chaos, or else writing it down isn't going to be any better than having it floating around in your head. When I try to create like a linear narrative, which we can go over next time when we talk about outlining, is I just try to put everything together. My initial summaries, initial outlines are kind of just like a collection of parts. You know, I haven't really assembled them into an outline yet. It's kind of a summary, but like there'll be bits of dialogue. Like I want a character to say something to the gist of. I want the interaction between these two characters to be, you know, in this fashion to motivate the plot to get it to here. I'm not sure how I'm going to segue this paragraph from this scene transition into the next one, but I'll figure that out. But it needs to happen this way. And it's, you know, it's almost like a puzzle piece. So you can shift things around, nothing's set in stone yet, but you have just the basic idea of how you want to get from point A to point B to point C, which you refine more in the outline process. But it is important to take all those ideas that you've written down and try to assemble them into something that's like a step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 linear narrative. You can change it up and fix it up as much as you want, but you do want to try to get organized with your ideas, or else you'll never get anything off the ground. And the important thing is to just do it. All the planning stuff is the most important part of storytelling, of writing a comic, of writing a novel, of writing anything. And I've met people who just don't do it. The first thing they do is they try to take their ideas in their head and then open up a Word document and call it, you know, script draft 1. They go straight from the ideas in their brain to the script, and they don't know where to start. They don't know how to get started. They'll begin their first draft and they'll get like 10 pages into it and go, oh, this is terrible. And they'll delete it and they'll start over again, and they'll do it like 5 or 6 times and not get anywhere. And like, well, you know, it's like an architect doesn't just like start from, you know, idea to getting the bricks and mortar together. They have to, you know, they have to draw a blueprint and design their building first before they even try to, you know, build it. And that's the same thing with writing a script. You want to do all of your planning first and get all that stuff down on paper before you even type word 1 of your first draft. And I mean, I've met some people who just say like, I don't do that. No, I just go straight. It takes too much time. I just want to go straight from brain to script. I don't have time to do all that pre-planning stuff. And like, yeah, I know, dude, because either you've never written anything or published anything in your life because you never get past that first draft, or the stuff you've written is not very good. You know, I don't want to tell them that to their face, but it's like, yeah, you don't do the planning stuff, and it shows in the final product of what you've written that you didn't plan any of it out. So for me, just these first steps are the most vital before you even get to this first draft of your script.
So, Aaron, you know, obviously you dropped out there for a second. Mark was just talking about, you know, just his final thoughts on brainstorming before we get people set up for the next lesson. Do you have any final thoughts on the brainstorming process before you're ready to outline your actual story?
Yeah, actually, one thing that I find as I move into the story, you know, you've written all these things down, you've got all your ideas, and you're like, now how do I assemble them? And the way that I work, and I don't know, Mark might work differently. It'll be interesting. Yeah, I'm excited to kind of like hear what his process is, because I always like talking process with other writers, because you can glean so much information and you can, you know, use it to fine tune your own. But what I do is, like I said, I start out, you know, I have the idea, and then I say, okay, where does this end? What's the end game? What's going to be the satisfying conclusion? And then I kind of work backwards from there. So I'll decide, well, now what's my opening? Because, you know, you want to have a, you know, I still believe in comics having that big opening where, you know, you turn to that splash page and there's something, you know, you get that splash page and there's something that immediately hooks you. You know, you want to grab them right away. And, you know, you want to have some good action within the first 7 pages, because otherwise, what's the point? You know, your best adventure franchises, you know, that have endured, like, you know, James Bond, a lot of these superhero things, they'll open with some kind of action that grabs you and pulls you into the story. So you have to decide on that. So now you've got your ending, you've got your beginning, and you're like, how do I work through the middle? Okay, well, decide where your characters are going, decide what they have to learn, you know, decide what their, you know, the ultimate takeaway of all this is, what subplots you're going to put into the story, you know, to lead to the next thing. And then I do what's called a pagination. And it's very simple. I decide how many, and it really kind of helps me with the pace of my story. So I'll do a little Excel document with, like, you know, some blocks. Let's say I have 22 pages to work with. I'll have 22 blocks And on each one, I'll just put like a single line description of what happens on that page. And we've talked before, I don't like to break pages in the middle. I like to break the page on the turn. So each page has to move the story forward in some way. It has to serve the ending in some way. Like, where are we going? So that's kind of like how I break it down.
So is that an actual outline?
Yeah, it's like basically it kind of like becomes like my first draft of the outline. That's just one sentence that
Okay,
happens.
Yeah.
That happens on each page. And
Yeah,
then
that's what I do too, the page breakdowns. And that's basically, once I have those, the script is almost easy.
Right. You know, now all you have to decide is what your characters say, and you know what the I don't know how much detail you give Tim in how you kind of see the story, but you know, working with like Silvani on Darkwing Duck, he likes a very detailed
hmm
you know, a panel breakdown, and he may not use it. He may come back and say, I've got a better idea, or I can tell this in less panels, or I can. But he likes to have that as a guide, because then that gets his brain working. It helps him see what I see, and then we kind of decide what ultimately, now that our two visions have come together, what's the page going to look like.
That's how Tim actually specially requested when I first started scripting with him. I was like, Mark, can you do a panel breakdown and just like panel 1, this is what happens, and then include the dialogue captions. And like you said, like, so I trust, like, Tim's the artist. He's the one who has to visualize the story. I know we're getting too close into outline. We don't want to repeat too much, but just to piggyback on that, is that you're writing your script. I know it's ahead of ourselves, but just remember that you're writing a comic, not a novel, not a prose story. So you're writing for your artist. It's important to know who your artist is, to talk with your artist, and to find out what they want, the way they want your script to be formatted, so that it works most intuitively with them and serves their strengths. So like Tim asked, like, Mark, can you give me like panel breakdowns with the dialogue, because that will help guide, you know, my mind's eye as to how the characters are reacting, the way they should. I'll know what they're saying, but I need to know, you know, how they should look while they're saying it, what emotions they should be expressing, what the context is, et cetera, all that stuff. And there are other ways of writing comic scripts. There's like the Marvel method, where you just write page
All right,
one.
we're going to far field here, Mark.
I know, but it's just before we get ahead of ourselves, you know, just remember you are writing for an artist, because this is a comic. So always keep your artist in mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
So from that one little log line on each pagination page, I'll go to a more detailed outline where, okay, so now I kind of know what needs to happen on the page, and then I'll write some beats of the page. You know, I kind of want this to happen. I kind of want this to happen. This would be a cool visual. And then go back to James and say, you know, like, well, what do you think of this? And then he'll come back and say, I could draw this, I could draw that, you know, I could do this way. It'd be kind of cool if we did this. And then I'll alter it. And so now I have my full outline to work from, and then I'll start the actual script.
So guys, so we're going to wrap up our brainstorming episode right here. Well, let's talk about next week, or not next week. In 2 weeks, we're going to come back. We're going to be talking about outlining your story. So I'm imagining the viewers are going to come back. They're going to have brainstormed. They're going to develop these characters the way that you've described them. Then maybe they've done a pagination where they have a brief sentence about what each page is going to be. Mark, what do you think they need to have accomplished before they're ready to outline their story? Very briefly. Just so
Okay, very briefly. So basically all the stuff we talked about for the last 5 minutes is what we're going to talk about in greater detail next time, because the paginations, or the page breakdowns as I call them, that's all part of the outline. All they really need to do in the brainstorming process before they get to the outlining process, the page breakdowns and the paginations, just write your ideas down, develop your characters in a character biography, get the basic, like, point A, point B, point C of your story. And then once you have those together, you can start assembling them into a narrative, which you would then develop in the outlining process next 2 weeks. Perfect. And do you have anything to add to that, Aaron, or a different approach?
No, I think Mark was pretty succinct. I think that's really sound advice. That's how I approach it. And I think that if people have individual questions about like what this means, you know, or, you know, they can certainly hit us on Twitter. They can drop something in the comments, and you know, we'll do our best to respond and to answer their questions. I think that you know, this is a really kind of cool thing. We'll be able to interact with people and help them understand, the process and develop their own process. So yeah, definitely interact with us, guys. We would really like to hear from you.
And if you want to do that live, we are broadcasting this live on my Twitch channel, and then I'm going to upload it on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, this has already happened. And if you want to be there live for the next one, there's a link in the video description. You come back not next Sunday, but the Sunday after at noon Eastern, and we're going to do the same thing. Hopefully, we might have to change the times, but I will get that word out via the community tab on YouTube. I'll also tweet it out, do it in my Discord as well. And hopefully Mark and Aaron will be able to come back. We're going to be talking about outlines next week. Now, we do have one question from the live audience today, and this was from Skull. I think it's Messenger.
Meister, Skullmeister?
It's MESI. I think it's Messenger, but I might be wrong. For writing a story, when do you put chapter issue breaks, or do you write it out as chapters?
Well, each it depends on how you're working. For example, doing a monthly comic book, 22 pages, that essentially is a chapter in your story. Now, you might have different, like I said, I like to do so I don't really think of it as chapter breaks in that, and in that sense. Mark has written novels, so maybe he can give a different perspective on this. But as far as the comic goes, when you do your pagination, which is also going to give you, I don't want to say that's, and it is different than the outline, because what you're doing is you're breaking down your page turns. This is going to be a double page spread, so it needs to be on.
Yes, and nuts and bolts, basically.
Yeah. You're really, you're really like fine tuning it. So this is where the dramatic thing is going to happen. So this needs to be on a page turn. You need to turn the page, and then boom, there it is. And it's shocking, and you didn't see it coming, or it's the villain reveal. You turn the page, and oh, there he is. This is the big bad guy that's behind everything.
Yeah. So I can't get too involved in some of the example that I have, but I was hired to write a 60-page graphic novel for someone. And so I paced it as a 60-page story. I had act structures in it, and then I did my page breakdowns. But when you pace a story, you have to know how many pages you're going to have in advance. And I know this is getting closer to outlines and nuts and bolts and stuff, but just to answer Skullmeister's question.
The lesson. This is just for the
just
audience.
for Skullmeister.
I will include it in the video just because people might have questions, but we're past the brainstorming thing. We'll talk about whatever anybody wants to now.
Well, so here's the thing. So you have to know how many pages you're doing in advance. So when I do Black Ops, I know the story is going to be 52 pages 64 pages for Black Ops. Common America is 52 pages. So that helps me figure out how many pages to set aside for this or that, and how to do my page breakdowns, and where to end the story, how to end the story, because I know how my story arc is going to go, my multi-issue story arc. So Black Ops, we do things in 3 volumes, because 3 volumes fill an omnibus. Common America, we do them in 4 volumes. So we know what the story we want to tell in each volume, and what our narrative beats are, how we want to end each volume to lead into the next one, etc. But when I was hired in the past to write that 60-page graphic novel, I paced it as a 60-page complete story. And I scripted it, and I wrote it as a 60-page complete story. My understanding was that after I had written it, I think the second draft, the editor, I guess you could call him, came back to me and said, "Mark, by the way, could you break this up into a 3-issue miniseries? Just basically take your script and segment it by 20 pages each." It's not paced that way, though. If you have to think of each issue or each volume, however your story is going to be released in an isolated format, you have to pace it for that many pages and that format. So whether it's a 60-page story or a 20-page story, you need to pace it to have that flow and the action within the first 7 pages, right? And then you have to have the peak and valley, in the middle. And then you have to have the big cliffhanger or the big climax at the end of your 20 pages or the end of your 60 pages. Taking a 60-page story and then trisecting it doesn't create 3 20-page stories. It just creates a 60-page story that's broken up awkwardly. And that's
it doesn't have the right breaking points where you have the dramatic reveal or the big cliffhanger that brings you back.
Exactly. It doesn't flow correctly. So when I wrote a 20-page graphic novel, a 60-page graphic novel, issue 20 didn't end on a cliffhanger or a lead-in to something big in the next issue. It was just a random page. I think it was mid-dialogue. between characters. You can't do it that way. So you have to always know the format you're writing for. Likewise, another project I had worked on, they said I was doing the page breakdowns, and like Aaron pointed out, you have to know your page turns. Your page turns are money. They're so important. That's the sweet spot, because that's your transition. That's where you can hide surprises, is on the page turn. So you always want to pace your script with page turns in mind, because that's where you can have your most impact. And so I kept trying to tell the editor, like, it's really important. Like, you keep telling me to add one page here or take one page away there, but that screws up all the page turns in the whole book if I take or add by one. And then he finally just said, like, Mark, it's not going to matter, because we're going to put advertisements in the book. We aren't going to know what pages those advertisements are going to be on. So yeah, and so he's like, so page turns don't matter, Mark. And I was like, okay, that's awesome. Like, that's a terrible way of doing things, but all right, I don't have a choice, or the editor. But if you're doing an independent comic, you're not going to put advertisements in the middle of your book. You're going to have that sort of control over it, that sort of thing. But always, like everything else, comics aren't written in a screenplay format. They aren't written in a manuscript format. They're written specifically as comic books, and you need to think of them that way when you're writing them.
Yeah.
So that leads directly into anime, and they have a question. I'm writing a story, and my experience is in standard prose, but I'm thinking of changing it to comic form. What are specific modifications I should make to my writing planning process?
The first thing that you're going to need to modify is probably the way that you do the dialogue, because you can be much more verbose in prose than you can in a comic book. You've only got so much real estate in a panel, and you want the art to tell the story. So you're going to adapt your script in a way that a lot of your description that you would be giving the reader in prose, you're going to be giving that to your artist. And your artist is then going to interpret that onto the page. So you're gonna be able to lose a lot of words there, right at the outset, because this is a show don't tell kind of medium. So it's a huge advantage for you as a writer, because you get to tell the story visually, and you can really focus in on cutting back the dialogue. I got a really good piece of advice from an ex that about when she read one of my scripts, and she said, I read these fashion magazines, and they always tell you, put on all the jewelry you want to wear, and then take at least one thing off. And she said, and I think that might help you with writing. She goes, because you definitely like dump everything down on the page, but then go through and start culling the things that you don't need. Just what do you need to show the character, who the character is, what the character's perspective is in the and what they, their drive is in the least amount of words. So, brevity is the soul of wit. You want to cut as much of that as possible. And you also don't want the art taken up by huge word balloons. I don't know if you've ever opened a comic book where there's just a wall of text. If you've ever read a Bendis book, the splash page, which is supposed to be your money shot, opening the book to hook the reader in. It should be something dynamic, something action, but you'll open it and it's two people talking, and it's just a wall of text, running down the page that you have to read their back and forth. And it's like, I don't care. I don't care about this. Like, why would I, this looks like homework.
Right.
This doesn't look fun. This now looks like work. Right, Mark? So
if I wanted to read a novel, I'd read a novel, not a comic.
Yeah, you have to write for the medium that I think this is a really good question, because you have to write for the medium that you're working in. So so what you really want to do is you want to kind of pare that down. You're going to tell the story visually, and work with your artist. Have a good back and forth, and don't be precious about the work, because comics are a collaborative process. When you sit down and you write a novel, often it's just, unless you have a co-writer, it's just you. But if you're writing a comic book, there needs to be a back and forth between you and the artist, because that's where you're going to get. If you guys can get that synergy where you're both on kind of on the same page and excited about the book, you are going to get a much better response from your readers, because your excitement and your passion for the project should translate to them.
Right. I mean, I don't think I'm not an artist, but if I were, if you're hiring your artist just to very robotically adapt precisely what you're writing with no wiggle room, like Alan Moore does, you're going to end up with an artist who isn't enjoying what he's drawing because he's not going to have any passion for it, because he's not really going to get to flex his creative muscles. He's just basically strictly adapting what you've written. And that's going to end up showing in the final, in the final work. You definitely want to collaborate with the artist and set your ego aside. So if you put in the script 7 panels and they decide as the artist, I can do this in 6, or maybe you accidentally put 2 separate actions for a character within 1 panel description, so they have to add an extra panel to make that work visually. Don't flip out, understand why they made those changes, why they used their visual eye to do that. But just for the question of adapting prose into a comic script format, everything Aaron said about dialogue is really good. Once we're going to do a video, I'm sure, on dialogue, so I won't get too deep into that. Just know that the more panels you put on a page, the less dialogue you can have, because as Aaron pointed out, the dialogue speech bubbles are going to take up space on the page, and the more panels you put on the page, the smaller those panels are. And so that means that there's going to be less art in each panel if you have to cover it up with a big speech bubble or a narrative box or something. So, like exactly as Aaron said, you need to restrict yourself. In your first draft, you can write all the dialogue you want, and then in the second draft, you can go in and you can prune it and slim it down. That's what I do. Is that I'm as Chris Claremont as I want to be in my first draft, because the first draft's for no one's eyes but me. But then I go back and I just start slimming it down. I start taking away the redundancies, things like that. If it's a character who talks in contractions, I'll add contractions because that'll save me a word, that kind of thing. You don't want to do the Chris Claremont. I'm picking on him a lot, but you don't want to have think of a Chris Claremont comic where Cyclops is blasting his optic blast out of his eyes. Like, that's the picture on the page. But then you have Cyclops saying, like, have a taste of my optic blast from my ruby quartz visor. Like, I don't need him to say that. I'm literally looking at him doing that sort of thing. But with prose, take your outline for your prose story and basically consider that your outline for your comic. Just start segmenting it. Break it down into the pages. Aaron and I are going to go over that in the outlining portion of these videos. Just keep in mind, like Aaron said, that you're working in a visual medium. So a lot of the text work you would do is actually going to end up being the work of the artist. So you definitely want to work with your artist.
Yeah, and you know what? I want to touch on something that Mark said that I think is really important too, where he said that you have to remember that a panel is a single action. So you can't write a panel where you say the hero flips into the air and then kicks the gun out of the villain's hand and then spin kicks the next villain. Those are 3 separate actions. It may be more depending on how dynamic you want it to be. So you have to remember that your first panel is going to be the character starting his flip. Then maybe you need a second panel where he's coming out of the flip and now his kick is disarming the other character. Now you have a third panel where the first character that had the gun is falling backwards and your hero is now spinning to face the second character. And now you have a fourth panel where they're kicking, the other villain. So you have to remember that your artist can only do one action in a panel at a time. So your script is probably going to be longer. So when you're working with prose, you can get more done in a page because, it's just words. But in a visual medium, you're going to need more pages to convey the action and to tell the story, and you'll need to pace your story out appropriately.
Well, I do want to say thank you very much to our instructors today. Obviously, Mr. Mark Pellegrini from Common America, Black Hops, and other comic books, and Mr. Aaron Sparrow from Darkwing Duck. Worked a lot on the Tokyo Pop?
Yeah, Tokyo Pop. Yeah, we didn't really establish the banning. I've done Warcraft, Devil May Cry, like all kinds of different properties for different things. So yeah.
Thank you guys for joining me today. Obviously, appreciate you answering the questions there. I think we were very successful. We got through brainstorming. I think we're very well set up for outlining, which we will cover in 2 weeks. And I hope to see you all live on Twitch. But if you can't make it here, this will be up on YouTube. Just like that will be up on YouTube, just like this one. Thank you all very much. I'll see you later.
Thank you, guys.